Hi, I'm Mike Atkins, and I'm one of the vice co-chairs of MAAWG, and I'm going to be talking to you about DMARC. Specifically, this is one of the breakout sessions from the larger DMARC training that Paul Midgen and I have done, and this section is specifically for domain owners and third-party senders who send mail on behalf of other domains. On the screen, you can see a brief overline of what I'm going to be talking about. Mainly, I'm going to be talking about something I like to call the reporting and compliance process. When you embark upon implementing DMARC as a domain owner, you are signing up for a long-term operational process. And that's mostly what I'm going to be guiding you through here today, what that process looks like, what's involved in it, what you get from it, why it's worth doing, and just some general information so that you can go into it prepared, knowing what you'll need to do. Specifically, I'm going to talk through publishing your initial DMARC record. I'm going to talk through some information for third-party senders and some of the different deployment profiles you're likely to see with different shapes and sizes of customers, because everyone's going to have slightly different needs. So you can be prepared for the different scenarios that you're likely to encounter when you start talking about DMARC with your customers. We're going to talk for quite a bit on report processing and analysis, because this is sort of the meat of what you as a domain owner are going to be doing. You're going to be processing the data that you get back from mailbox providers and figuring out what it really means and what sort of actions you need to take based on it. Then we're going to talk about the process of ramping up your policies, making them more aggressive if you find that there's work to be done and benefit to be gained from doing so. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the long-term monitoring. As I said, this is a permanent operational process that you're signing up for, and there is a long-term component. So here we have the basic high-level overview of how I like to think of this process. You can think of it in terms of 3 phases. The first one is your initial auditing. This is when you're going through your infrastructure, basically getting everything up to compliance, and looking at the first set of reports that you get back to find out if you actually have a phishing problem that DMARC can help with. The second part is initial policy ramp-up, shown there in yellow. That's the process of basically just bringing your policies up to an aggression level that you are both comfortable with and that has a meaningful impact on the amount of abuse that your domain is experiencing. And the third part is that ongoing monitoring and maintenance. That's the long-term part, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So to get started, it's actually very simple. Everyone's first DMARC record should look basically the same. And it should look sort of like this. You need a version tag, as we told you in the last section. DMARC, currently the only version is 1. You set your policy to none because you don't want to take any actions yet. You just want to get data. And then you specify where you want your aggregate reports sent. If you're also interested in getting forensic reports, you can add that tag here. And if you're making use of some sort of third-party service or intermediary service to parse your reports for you and provide you data, you would put their address here as well. This is really all that's required to get started as a domain owner. This will get you data. This will get you aggregate reports, and then you can start going through your initial auditing process based on the data that you get. So I'm going to pause here for a second and talk a little bit about the third-party deployment profiles. So if you're an ESP or some sort of hosting provider or anyone that sends mail on behalf of other domains, this is a section that you'll want to pay attention to. So there are lots of different shapes and sizes of customers that you might serve. You may specialize in one particular vertical, one particular type of customer, like your particular market might be very, very small domains, very small businesses with only a handful of employees who need a lot of care, and you provide a lot of automated services to them. You might, your specialty might be very, very large organizations, and you have a lot of direct contact with their sales staff, but maybe not so much with their technical staff, and kind of everywhere in between. So what I've tried to do here is kind of give some very broad general categories of the kinds of deployments that you might do with different classes of customers. I don't expect that all of your customers will neatly fit into one of these, but it should give you some idea of what the spectrum is and allow you to kind of tell where your customers will fall, possibly in between 2 different options, possibly on the low or high side of one or another, just to give you an idea of what your responsibilities will be when dealing with that kind of customer. So the names of the 4 categories that I've come up with are controlled, authorized, delegated, and hosted. And the graph here shows the technical responsibility of the domain owner on the x-axis and the amount of control and visibility they have on the y-axis. And what you can see is that as you go up through these different categories, the amount of technical responsibility that the domain owner is taking on increases, but also the amount of visibility or control that they have increases. So what you can sort of see and get a sense here is if you're the sort of provider who does basically everything for your customers, perhaps you run the hardware for them and all they do is give you the mail they want you to send and you take care of it. If you run their DNS servers as well, because you're a full hosting provider, then they're going to be very, very low on this spectrum. They're going to be in the hosted category where you're doing basically everything for them. They have very little responsibility, but they also have very little visibility or control because they rely on you for everything. On the very high side, you have the sort of very paranoid, very controlling, very technically competent customer who will want control over everything. They will probably want to generate their own DKIM keys because they might have security policies that say no one outside our organization are allowed to generate cryptographic keys on behalf of us. That's something we must do ourselves. They will want to run their own DNS, and they will want to dictate to you, how you're going to send their mail and where you're going to send it from. And then in the middle, there's sort of the broad range of options of the other kind of setups you can have where they're a little less demanding, a little less technical. They don't mind if you do some of the work for them, or they want to be a little more hands-off because they're mostly a marketing or business shop and they don't really have much of a technical wing. They know a little bit about it, but mostly they're going to want you to handle it. So this is kind of a very broad spectrum. Again, I don't expect that your clients are going to directly nail one of these, but this should give you some idea of what to expect and kind of you can start thinking about where your customers will fall on this spectrum and what sort of responsibilities you're going to have when you start talking to them about DMARC. So starting with the category that gives the domain owner the most control and also the most responsibility is what I call controlled. This is a situation where, as I said, the domain owner wants control of absolutely everything, and they're really just using you to send mail. Chances are they are going to generate their own DKIM keys. They're going to give them to you. They are going to ask you what IP addresses you're going to consistently send their mail from, and they're going to update their SPF record. They'll probably tell you what domain or subdomains to send mail from. This is a very, very high-profile client probably that has a very serious phishing problem and wants to maintain a lot of control over what they're doing. These might be very large, competent financial institutions or online retailers or perhaps social networks or things like that where their brand is very visible and they have a very large and active internal organization dedicated to abuse prevention, fraud prevention, anti-phishing already, and they just see this as an extension of all of their existing programs as opposed to a new thing that they're doing that they're going to mostly let you handle. So the pros of this sort of scenario, the controlled scenario, are that the domain owner retains control over most all aspects of it. That's something that some people are going to look for and they're really going to want. So it's important for you as a third party, if you're going after those sorts of clients, to kind of understand that this is the sort of situation they're going to put you in where they're going to be dictating a lot of terms to you because that's just how they do it. The cons to this, are that there's going to be a lot of interaction required. Every time you make infrastructure changes, you're going to have to coordinate with them before you start sending any mail. Anytime they make any sorts of changes, like when they roll their DKIM keys, for example, they're going to have to give you the keys in advance so that you can set them up. There's basically just more manual overhead. But again, these are likely to be very large, very high-value clients that are probably worth having some dedicated analysts or points of contact in your organization with, and just be aware that there will be kind of a high level of coordination between your organization and theirs if this is the kind of setup that they want. This one should also be very rare because there aren't very many organizations that make use of third-party senders that also have these kind of strict security requirements or abuse problems. Taking a step down, the next category I refer to as authorized. This is going to be a category that more third parties will run into because it's more commonly found out in the industry. What's going to distinguish this from a controlled setup is that the domain owner is going to be looking to you as the third party to dictate more of the content of DNS records. Perhaps you'll be creating the DKIM keys and giving them to them, and they'll be putting them in DNS. You'll be dictating what goes in the SPF, or perhaps even DMARC records, and telling them what goes in there. The difference here that separates it from the lower levels is that you still retain control as the domain owner of your own DNS, and the third party is mostly dictating what goes in those records. This is useful because provisioning can be streamlined somewhat. If you are the third party and you have lots of customers in this category, then you can automate some of the tasks of things like creating the keys that you're going to give them, automating the SPF record changes that your customer will want to make, and you can sort of standardize how that's going to work because you're going to kind of do all of your customers in the same manner since they're not dictating the content of the records to you. The cons here are that there is still some management issues for domain owners because they are still updating the DNS records, and it can get a little cumbersome for them as the domain owner if they work with multiple third parties, because then they have requests coming from multiple places. But that's all, you know, the sort of thing that they're kind of signing up for when they use multiple third parties anyway. There might be some contractual issues that you need to keep in mind here around things like DKIM key management and key strength, key length, things like that. There have recently been issues around shorter DKIM key length, shorter than 1024. And so we are recommending that people sign their mail with at least a 1024 key as opposed to shorter ones. We are aware that many implementations are moving in a direction of not considering shorter keys than that valid anymore, which means that you'll start getting back failed results on mail that validated according to DKIM, but that the inbound system, the mailbox provider, simply didn't think your key was strong enough to warrant a DMARC alignment result. Taking another step down, this is likely to be a very common scenario for most ESPs. This is going to be what we call a delegated scenario. And this is distinct from authorized in that the domain owner basically delegates control of their DNS records to the third party. That's going to be done at the DNS level with something like a CNAME or redirecting to your servers. It's a bit more hands-off, and what's really required on their side is to just point, you know, the appropriate DNS at the third party and let the third party take care of it. Again, there's going to be contractual issues here since you're not only dictating record content, but you're updating it as the third party. And the domain owners are giving up quite a bit of control by letting you do that, but they're also taking less technical responsibility onto themselves and trusting you to take care of the problem for them. And the final category is what I refer to as hosted. This is going to be a situation where if you are a hosting provider, then this will be the scenario that you'll find yourself in most of the time. This is distinguished by the domain owner basically owning nothing other than the registration. You or another third party own their DNS servers, and you may have to work with another third party or convince your client to move hosting of your DNS to your service in order to accomplish this. At this point, the domain owner has little to no control. You have full operational control because they've given you control of everything. Chances are you host every aspect of the domain, from the web presence to perhaps all the mailboxes, in addition to the DNS records and any mail sending that they're doing. For ESPs, this is going to be a very rare sort of scenario. This is really more if you're a hosting provider or you offer some cloud-based services or something like that. So to kind of sum up the 4 different categories and give you an idea of what the different responsibilities of the third-party provider is for each of them, we have this chart. Down the side, you can see the sort of different high-level actions or tasks that are responsible for setting up a domain authentication program, setting up DMARC, and maintaining it going forward. And as you can see, as you move from controlled to hosted, more and more things are the responsibility of the third party as opposed to the domain owner. In the case of controlled, basically, you as the third party have to provide SPF record content. You have to say what IP addresses you're going to be sending their mail from, and you'll be responsible for rotating their DKIM keys when they give you the keys to rotate. When you move down into a more authorized sort of profile, chances are you as the Third party will be creating the DKIM keys and then giving them back to the domain owner to publish for you. You'll still have to provide SPF record content. And you'll still have to rotate the keys, although you'll be generating them yourself, so that'll be a little bit easier to streamline than if the domain owner were creating the keys and giving them to you. When you move down to delegated, now several more things are the responsibility of the third party. I'd like to draw special attention to processing DMARC reports at the bottom. This is one that's going to be kind of up for negotiation. There are companies that specialize in processing DMARC reports. There are open source tools available for processing DMARC reports. You as a third party might find that your customers are interested in having you handle those reports for them. You might find that your customers are interested in you building tools to parse those reports and give them action items, or if you're mostly responsible for the DMARC record and its maintenance and the related authentication records, that you are the one that actually has to make changes to them to make sure everything stays in compliance. If you're the sort of ESP or third party that provides a lot of tools to your users and does a lot of data analysis and inspection and reporting, then you might find that you have the capabilities in-house to build out a DMARC report parser and make that a part of your product offering. If not, you might want to think about partnering with one of the existing intermediaries or looking at the open source tools if you're interested in having that as part of your program. When you move all the way down to the hosted category, again, you are doing everything for the domain owner. Chances are you will have to be processing DMARC reports as you get them and making decisions, or perhaps providing an online interface for your domain owners to interact with the data, or perhaps make some high-level choices about whether they want to move up to a quarantine or reject policy. But again, since you have full control of the DNS records, it's going to have to be your system that actually makes the changes to the records, whether you present any sort of GUI to the users to make those sorts of decisions or not. Now I'm going to go back to talking about the report processing and analysis process in more detail, starting with the first phase, which I call initial auditing. If you're interested, there are report parsing tools available at dmarc.org. If you are in the process of developing tools to parse DMARC reports, please get in touch with us via DMARC Discuss. We would love to list it on our website, since right now there's only a few available tools, and we'd really like to see a wider variety of them out there so that people have some more options. So the first step, when you've published your first DMARC record and you've gotten your first set of aggregate reports back from the mailbox providers that you send mail to, is to start by categorizing the IP addresses that are present in that report. You should see all of your own infrastructure there. You should see the IP addresses that you send from, you should see your domains that you send from, and you should see volume numbers that roughly equate to what your other metrics say you send. So start by identifying your own infrastructure, denote them, and set them aside. Then move down to looking for any authorized third parties you might have. This would be third-party senders that you contract with who send mail on your behalf that you know of. And lastly, what you should be left with after you've identified your own infrastructure and the third parties that you've authorized to send on your behalf are unauthorized third parties. Now, it's very important that you keep in mind that unauthorized third parties are not necessarily phishers. They are not necessarily spoofing your domain. At this point, they're just parties that you were not previously aware of. It could be that another part of your company has contracted with a third party that you didn't know about, and that's just their mail that you're seeing in the report. So the process here is really set aside everything you know and then start drilling down on the things you don't know. Don't immediately assume that you have an abuse problem, but dig a little further to try to find out what the unauthorized third parties are. So for both your infrastructure and the authorized third parties that you've set aside, you should identify who owns them within your business, who owns the relationship with a third party, or who owns the DNS and mail sending infrastructure. If that's you, then great, you get to do most of this work yourself. If not, then you might need to get to know some people in your organization a little better and get a sense of what their priorities are and what their process for rolling out changes are. You may need to first deploy domain authentication if you don't actually have SPF and DKIM deployed for your domains when you start asking for reports. This is very important because, again, DMARC is based on DKIM and SPF. And if you don't already have those deployed, then there's really not much that DMARC can do from you aside from sending you reports, telling you that your mail is not authenticated. So first, take a look at your own infrastructure, your authorized third parties, and figure out how far out of compliance they are in terms of authentication, and figure out what you're going to need to do to bring them up to compliance. Depending on the size and complexity of your organization, this may be very expensive, and it may take kind of a long time. If you have subsidiaries, if you have acquired companies, if you have lots of branch offices that are largely autonomous, that have their own IT departments and their own mail servers, it might take you some time to bring all of your mail servers up to compliance. Once you've gotten everything authenticating, then you need to make sure that identifier alignment is occurring according to DMARC. This is sort of the new thing that we added. This is the policy layer on top of just DKIM and SPF passing that ties back the authenticated domains to that from domain that users perceive the mail as being from. So it's very important that you spend time aligning your identifiers according to DMARC so that you can move forward. If you don't do that, you're going to get reports that tell you that your mail is authenticated but not compliant according to DMARC, and you can't move any further. Depending on how large and complex your organization is, how far out of compliance you are, and how varied your uses of email may be, you may need to come up with a great deal of business justification to justify doing all of this work. So be prepared for that. This is sort of like turning over a rock for the first time you get your aggregate reports. You may not know where all your mail is coming from. You may not know how far out of compliance you are. There may be a lot of work here that you weren't expecting. So just be prepared and know that you may have a long road ahead of you. You may have to write business cases to justify the amount of work and expense that it's going to take to bring you up to compliance, and just be prepared. For some people, it goes very easily. For some people, if you're a large financial institution, it can take quite some time, and you will have to justify it as you go. I think the key part to remember about DMARC is that prior to DMARC, you couldn't even start doing this work. It might seem like you're taking a large project on yourself, but this is work that you simply could not do before you had DMARC reports. You had no way of knowing where your mail came from. So although it might bring a lot of work to you, it also provides a great deal of visibility and empowers you to actually do this work, whereas before you were just sort of running blind. So the next step, after you've identified your own mail and your authorized third parties, and you've started doing the work to bring them into compliance, is to identify the actual malicious activity that you see. This will involve researching those unauthorized third parties that you didn't recognize and labeling the ones that you believe are abusive. Now, to do this, you can use things like some public data sources. There are publicly available blacklists where if you find the IP addresses that you found to be unauthorized third parties, that's a pretty good sign that there are some people abusing your domain. There are vendor services that can allow you to do this. There's various, there's lots of data online in terms of IP addresses and URLs that send phish or that are suspicious, or websites that are suspicious. Take advantage of all of those to try to find out how much of the mail you're sending correlates with those public data sources of known abusive email. And especially make sure to look for the known failure cases, things like forwarding, things like mailing lists. People may be doing things with your mail that you don't expect or that you don't know once it leaves your administrative domain. So make sure to look for those in the unauthorized third parties, because those are probably not abuse. And if you proceed assuming that all of the unauthorized third parties are abusive, then you're probably going to cause a lot of false positives if you have anyone using your mail for those sort of use cases. Lastly, forensic reports can be really helpful in determining whether your unauthorized third parties are abusive or not. Since that gives you the full raw email, it'll show you the content, it'll show you the domain. So anyone you can get to send you some forensic reports will aid you greatly in determining how much of that unauthorized third-party mail is actually abusive mail. So once you have everything categorized into your infrastructure, authorized third parties, unauthorized third parties, and abusers, you can actually perform a threat assessment on the email that claims to be from your domain. This is very important because not everyone actually has a spoofing problem. Not everyone has a phishing problem. DMARC is specifically for domains that we believe have a problem that needs to be solved. We as the DMARC working group have no expectation that everyone on the internet is going to publish a DMARC record with a reject policy. There's simply no reason for most domains to do that because there's no one actually abusing them. We think there's no reason not to publish a policy with a none action to get data so that you can monitor it. But we don't expect that everyone is going to come to the conclusion that they really need to reject mail if they don't actually find abuse. It's just not necessary. So once you have your categories set up, you can do some math to figure out how big your problem actually is. So the first thing you want to do is calculate the sum of unaligned mail from each category. Unaligned mail from abusers is phish. Definite false positives are unaligned mail from your infrastructure or unaligned mail from authorized third parties. Potential false positives are any unaligned email from unauthorized third parties that you hadn't previously labeled as abusive. So once you have all these numbers, you should consider how much phish is there versus how many false positives are there. How much phish is there versus the total volume of aligned mail you send. And this will give you an idea of what the cost benefits are of moving forward with policy actions in DMARC. If you find no phish, then you don't have a domain spoofing problem. And you don't need to move any further forward with DMARC other than continuing to monitor. That alone is quite valuable. Until now, there was no way to tell without engaging with a vendor in an open way whether you actually definitely had a phishing problem or not. So if you learn nothing else from publishing a DMARC record and getting the reports, you'll find out whether or not your domain is actually being abused. If you find that you have a phishing problem, then you can move forward, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. If you find that you don't have much phish and it would cause a lot of false positives, then please don't proceed. If you find that you have some phish and some false positives, then it's kind of a value judgment for you. How much phish is there? Do you think you could, by way of the forensic reports, take action against the phishers without moving forward with DMARC? Could you send legal notices? Could you supply that data to some sort of public blacklist or other service that would keep their mail from being delivered? There's other steps you can take with the data that can help reducing your phishing problem other than proceeding with publishing very strict policies, especially if you feel that you have too many false positive cases and it would cause too big of a mess. So assuming that at the end of your threat assessment, you come to the conclusion that you want stronger policies, you have a large amount of phish and very few, if any, false positives that you're concerned about, then you'll want to proceed with ramping up your policy. And that's phase 2 of the overall process, as you can see in yellow there. So the first step in ramping up your policies is first verify that everything works as expected. Just to be sure, first step is always take the reports, look at them, make sure nothing has changed, make sure that the record change you're about to make will have just the impact that you expect it to. And the second step is updating your record. Now, one of the issues that caused previous attempts at this sort of functionality to fail was that there was no way to ease into it. They were all or nothing sort of switches that you threw. So one thing that we tried very hard to provide with DMARC is a way to ease into these sorts of policies, to sort of mitigate any unforeseen issues that might arise and go about it in a operationally sane and slow and controlled way. So that's what the percent field is for in DMARC. So the first step to updating your record is to change your P equals none to P equal quarantine and set the percent to 10, or perhaps a lower number if you send a lot of mail and you're really, really concerned about taking this first step. That should cause only 10% of the mail that is unaligned to be quarantined, which means if there are any false positives, you've reduced them by approximately 90% by starting at just a 10% quarantine rate. I want to make sure to caution everyone not to go straight to a reject policy. Please, whatever you do, do not go from none straight to reject. we put a lot of work into making sure that people can slowly ramp up this sort of thing and take softer actions until they're certain that they're doing everything right and that they have all their bases covered. Please don't just ride right past all that and go straight to reject. I can guarantee that something you do not expect will go wrong and it will cause more false positives than you're comfortable with. So please do take good use of those safety features that we built into the protocol and ease into it. So once you've updated your policy, then you monitor your reports for issues and address them as you find. This is generally going to be 24 hours later, since that's the reporting cycle that most people are on. So on one day, you change your record. The next day, you get your reports. You go through the same process again, categorize them into your infrastructure, authorized third parties, unauthorized third parties, and abusers. Look at the rates of aligned mail to phish to false positives. See if they've changed as you would expect from the record change that you make, and make a go, no-go decision. Is it time to keep wrapping the policy up? Is there an issue and we need to roll back? Do we need to hold steady for a couple of days and make sure that things pan out? And then, assuming that everything looks fine, then step 4 is again increasing the percentage on your record. So depending on how bold you want to be, you might go up 10% a day, you might go up 25, 50, 75. It's really up to you, but please, whatever you do, take some incremental steps and don't just go directly to 100%. Once you get all the way to 100% quarantine, if you haven't encountered any issues, there's still abuse going on and you're not causing any false positives, then you may want to go ahead and go to reject. Please only do this if you have thoroughly studied your data, if you've ramped up slowly, if you've left it at 100% quarantine for long enough for any potential false positive issues to pan out, either by being handled on your end or at the majority of the large mailbox providers' ends, and then go to reject. Again, we took a lot of time coming up with a way for people to roll these things out in a very controlled fashion to avoid false positives, and I really encourage everyone to take advantage of them and be very careful with this. So once you have your policy initially where you're comfortable, then you go into the sort of ongoing monitoring phase of this. And this is that long-term operational process where once you put a DMARC record out there, you're signing up to get reports forever, right? Everyone's going to keep sending you reports as long as you're sending mail, and it's your responsibility to parse them, look for issues, and act on them. You might notice that the ongoing monitoring phase listed in green there looks very similar to the two phases that came before it, kind of squashed together, and that's basically exactly what it is. Every day you're going to get reports, and every day you should do your categorization again. Identify your infrastructure, identify your authorized third parties, identify unauthorized third parties, and identify abusers. And compare that to previous reports to find out what has changed. Do you see new infrastructure that you didn't think you deployed? Then you should probably take the time to go around your organization and figure out who it is that's doing that. Chances are, if you have a strict policy published, those people are not able to deliver their mail if they didn't actually get in touch with you first to make sure that it was authorized and aligning. This is actually seen as a feature to several enterprise security professionals because they have a problem with people in their organization deploying new infrastructure without notifying them first. So one of the things that, and I've experienced this myself, is that by publishing a strict DMARC record, you are preventing people from deploying new infrastructure without bringing it into compliance first. Chances are, by getting in touch with you to find out what those requirements are. This may ruffle some feathers in your organization. You may want to take some proactive steps to educate people. Obviously, you know, there's turnover and not everyone will get the memo, but you should at least be proactive in taking steps to let people know that you're adding a new long-term operational process, and as they bring new infrastructure online, they will have to comply with it or it simply will not work. So if you find no deltas in the IP addresses sending your mail from your most current report to the previous ones, then there's really nothing else to do. If you find changes, if you find new unauthorized third parties that you're not sure are abusive or not, or if you find an increase in abuse, or if you find an authorized third party has changed their infrastructure and that is no longer in compliance, then you have some work to do. Every day you should reassess the threat level based on those deltas. If you find that phishing has increased and you're not already at 100% reject, you might want to consider ramping up your policy some more. If you find changes in unaligned email volume, you'll probably want to go through and make sure that your categorization of unauthorized third party to abusers is as robust as it should be. It's possible that you have a phishing problem that you're unintentionally categorizing as benign when in fact it is malicious behavior. So you should be on the lookout for, as I said before, any infrastructure changes in your organization, any new products or new subdomains that people may be deploying, any new authorized third parties, things like mergers and acquisitions, anything that is going to change your infrastructure or where your mail comes from, you need to be on the lookout for. If you can get ahead of those things and handle them proactively, then you should not experience any undue delivery issues due to DMARC. And the one thing I can guarantee is that if you don't stay ahead of those sorts of things, eventually someone in your organization will deploy something new and your DMARC record will cause an issue, and then you'll have to do a lot of cleanup and a lot of explaining why you do it in the first place. Again, consider very carefully what your phishing level looks like, what your threat level is, and make decisions based on that as to whether your policies should be more aggressive, whether you should pursue any legal action against abusers that you're getting data on, and really just look for ways that the data that you get from DMARC can feed other processes you may already be engaged in. Again, if you have already a division responsible for investigating fraud or abuse and taking legal action against those people, you should really figure out how to use the data that DMARC gives you to empower their activities, or you might want to look at building out that sort of team at your company if you don't currently have one and you find that there's a lot of people trying to abuse you and you're getting good data on them due to DMARC. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention. I would please direct you to DMARC.org. That's our website where you can find the current version of the spec. You can sign up for our Discuss mailing list. You can look for any freely available tools or just in general communicate with people who are also deploying DMARC who might be able to help you with any issues that you encounter. Again, if you are in the process of deploying DMARC or developing tools, please do come. Let us know that you're getting involved with it. We love to hear from people. And if you're building out any capabilities that you're willing to share with people, we'd be happy to list them on our resources page. Thanks.